joining us as that conversation was happening. We just want you to know that the two are very much connected, not just because the hosts are the same, but also because the discussions that we have around the People's Migration Challenge have been taking place. We're now in round 5, and we have had different formats of it, where we've had panelists, but we've also had town hall discussions, and we are back again with panels in the People's Migration Challenge to really look at the interconnection between various elements of the Global Compact on migration. And I think a lot came out, and to digest it, I don't think we would do justice to it, but we would also just encourage those who didn't manage to make it, whether you were part of the Global Compact for Migration Certificate Program or you are, a friend of any of the partners, please just check the YouTube channel and you will be able to follow the very interesting discussions that we had today from representatives of government, including Ambassador Nahida, who's in Jordan, Ambassador from Bangladesh to Jordan, and Honorable Claudia from Portugal government. And I think we were also joined by Indonesian government official. So that was a very interesting discussion around pathways and what that means for migrants, and very interesting to hear about, for me as well, kind of taking down my notes in how regular pathways do not signify regularization. And that we have been able to see, I think, in many aspects with the examples that came not only from Portugal, but from many other spaces. So that wraps up that. And I think we are ready to start with our webinar. I would just have one more check to make sure that we have our panelists join us. Sophie, did you manage? Sophie still hasn't managed, I think, to link with us. We will try and see. Mihail, you're welcome. Can you hear me?
Yes, very well. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Which link did you manage? I think we need to try and see if we can get Sophie also with us.
Yes,
I think
the new one. Yes, exactly. With the first one, I could not get in, but the second one that you sent me, I think you can even see,
Yes, clear. We can see you as clear as though you were just in the neighborhood, and yet you're all the way in Mauritania. So no, that's good. And thank you for joining us. And Naomi, also thank you for joining us from Ireland. This is the beauty of virtual space and virtual work, that we get to see each other without taking a flight on our screens. So I think it's quite a privilege. So it's good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone who's joining us. We are here, like we do every Tuesday, to talk about and unpack the Global Compact for Migration webinar series. And every week we take time to dive into an objective of the 23 objectives of the Global Compact on Migration. And this is in connection to the certificate program that we have running since September. And that's going to go on for quite some time until we're done with the 23 objectives. We're only on 9 today, and 9 that have been loaded, very packed, that we have crossed, not just the experts, but we have crossed a lot of different topics, challenges, subjects, and also things to look forward to as we try to unpack the Global Compact for Migration. And today we are looking at GCM Objective number 9, which is counter smuggling. And the objective is centered around strengthening transnational response to smuggling of migrants. And the commitment reads, we commit to intensify joint efforts to prevent and counter smuggling of migrants by strengthening the capacities and international cooperation to prevent, investigate, prosecute, penalize the smuggling of migrants in order to end the impunity. Now, a loaded subject with many different aspects, many different angles to it. And I'm delighted today that we're joined by 4 panelists who are going to help us deliberate and dive into this topic from different angles. So we have Dr. Naomi Magugliani. You will tell me if I've pronounced it correctly, who is a research fellow in anti-trafficking law and policy at the British Institute of International and Comparative Law. And then we have Mr. Regimond Kuttapan, who is a journalist and senior research fellow with the International Institute of Migration and Development, which is one of our partners who is organizing this course. And then we have Sophie Hoffman, who is the program manager for IBM unit and she's based in the international organization in Niger. And her colleague joining us from IOM in Mauritania, Mihail Nobis, who is the lead for Integrated Border Management Unit based out of Mauritania. So thank you to all the panelists for finding time to join us today. We see that we may have had a few connection issues, but we will try and keep you afloat as we are today. Let's kick off the discussion with Naomi. Naomi, just as I, maybe give a bit of background so the participants may know, who will be speaking, and before we give you the question. Naomi is, like I said, she's a research fellow that works around anti-trafficking law and policy. And she has a PhD in law from the National University of Ireland, and where she has been conducting research on trafficked adult men, gendered constructions of vulnerability, and access to protection. And she also holds a law degree in international human rights law, as well as from the international relations from the University of Milan. And she's done some very interesting work, and I think most notably beyond the institution that she works for, she's the legal advisor to the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Trafficking in Persons. That's Professor Mulali, and she's also a legal researcher for the Global Legal Action Network. Many spaces that you have covered, Naomi, including some of the work that you have done with the International Organization for Migration in the framework of the Displacement Tracking Matrix. And I mention all this because it's very important and relevant for some of the questions that we have for you. So maybe you could just kick us off, because we do know that it seems as though there are these twinning concepts, or these twinning terms in the space of migration, particularly when we talk about irregular migration, smuggling and trafficking. So we're told that there is a difference between them. And what does it look like? And what becomes different when we talk about migrants, when we look at it in terms of legislation, in terms of policy? Also, where do we really draw the line on what is trafficking and what is smuggling? What can legislation that is there at play, whether it's at the global or the regional level, or even the national level and subnational in some cases, how can that be sort of used to counter the smuggling of migrants? So Naomi, over to you.
Thank you very much, Fadi, for the kind introduction and for the question. But I will try to address in at least two sets. So the first, in terms of the difference between smuggling and trafficking. You've mentioned legislation, policy, lived experiences. So the difference between smuggling and trafficking has been constructed as fairly clear-cut in legislation, but it tends to be either confused or politicized, oftentimes in policy, and it is often blurred for migrants themselves. In the context of legislation, we usually refer to the two protocols, so the protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons, especially women and children, that supplements the United Nations Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, that provides a definition of trafficking that consists of three elements. So we have an act element, recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of persons, a means element, the threats or use of force or other forms of coercion, abduction, fraud, deception, abuse of power or of a position of vulnerability, and purpose, exploitation, which shall include, according to the definition, at a minimum, the exploitation of the prostitution of others, practices similar to slavery, forced labor, the removal of organs. So although trafficking as a descriptive category for a phenomenon had already been present in earlier conventions, including as early as 1904, it was only legally defined in 2000. And this definition has then been replicated in regional instruments as well as in domestic legislation. So we have, for example, the ASEAN Convention, the Council of Europe Convention Against Trafficking. And most countries that are parties to the Palermo Protocol have transposed almost literally the Palermo definition in their domestic systems. Then on the other hand, we have the protocol against the smuggling of migrants by land, sea, and air that also supplements the UN Convention against Transnational Organized Crime, that defines smuggling as the procurement in order to obtain directly or indirectly a financial or other material benefit of the legal entry of a person into a state party of which the person is not a national or a permanent resident. There is in substance an act element, a transfer, for example, but no means nor exploitative purpose per se. Again, this definition has been replicated at times literally, at times paraphrased in a number of regional and domestic instruments, including, for example, the Council Directive 2002/90 of the European Union, the so-called Facilitation Directive. So we have a clear picture in terms of legislation, at least internationally speaking. But then in the context of policy, the dichotomies around which the protocols and the legal definitions are based govern contemporary public policy in a way that divides the field, in a sense, more along the lines of innocent and culpable actors, the trafficked person as the deserving individual in terms of protection, and the smuggled individual as an actor that has agency and that therefore contributes to a potential violation of immigration laws or criminal laws. In the discourse, trafficking and smuggling are often and problematically used interchangeably or politicized, again, in the absence of hard evidence, as we're seeing, for example, in the context of Belarus or the English Channel more recently, just to take two of the most complicated debates recently. But while naming a practice as trafficking carries a particular moral weight, it is also significant to remember that the two protocols differ in several key aspects, including in the protections that they afford to individuals and in the positive obligations to protect that would follow a so-called jurisdictional encounter between the state and the potentially trafficked person. Indeed, the trafficking protocol provides for a broad range of protective measures, while the smuggling protocol only contains a rather minimal reference to the protection needs of smuggled persons. Now, again, clear-cut in the law, politicized or weaponized in some instances in policy and discourse. And then lastly, we have the migrant category. So there are certainly pure cases of trafficking and pure cases of smuggling, but the majority of migration strategies and circumstances defy this easy categorization. So the one-off transaction that is usually associated with smuggling oftentimes results in a series of transactions as borders close off and routes need to change, so that the end result may be, in some instances, for example, that bondage, which can then turn into exploitation. So consent also can initially be given and then retracted as circumstances change, or it can be achieved by an individual, a smuggler, a trafficker, through less straightforward means of the trafficking protocol, for example, abuse of a position of vulnerability, thus rendering consent irrelevant, so that the lived realities contradict to a certain extent the clear-cut legal definitions. I don't want to take up too much time. I know that I can be speaking a lot.
That's good. I'm kind of nodding my head in thinking about a lot of things. When you've talked about, so smuggling has to do with a lot of even the protection measures would be very different from, from migrants who would have been smuggled compared to those who are potential victims of trafficking. It also seems there's an issue of agency in terms of, in terms of smuggled migrants, but that also becomes very blurry in the case of trafficking. On how do we define agency? And I have that question for you later on. How do we really define agency? And maybe to use another word for agency. I mean, what about desperation, and what does that do? In the sense of, in the sense of trafficking, or in the sense of smuggling, what space does that actually have? And therefore that gives me a bit more of kind of the motivation, the motivations that make potential people, prospect migrants, to want to opt to be smuggled, right? Because when we talk about agency, I wondered what that actually means in kind of also in a practical way. But I think maybe we come back to you as you shape that one around agency. Maybe you can help us also. I mean, we're aware that you've done some some research on smuggling, and or maybe even from kind of specific case laws that you could think of over the course of the work that you have done. What can you sort of tell us about the vulnerability of smuggled migrants? And I raise this because of the protection element that you also talked about. So maybe something around what access they have to any kind of rights, and who warrants these rights, and then also talking about, we're in a period where, we're calling it post-COVID, but here we are, we just had a new variant last week. So it's very confusing, this language of post-COVID. But in any case, what is really emerging maybe from the COVID times, and what do you sort of see as some of the worrying trends of this kind of efforts that should go in dismantling these smuggling networks that seem to be transnational in nature?
Sure, thank you. So in talking about vulnerability of migrants in general, and then in particular to smuggling, I'm struggling convinced that vulnerability ought to be understood through different lenses. It doesn't only mean one thing. It depends on the standpoint, it depends on the individual, it depends on the circumstances. So while most research and discussions focus on personal characteristics as the forum of vulnerability, be that because of gender or socioeconomic inequalities, membership of a particular social group, or marginalization, for example. But vulnerability should also be understood on a continuum and as both situational and relational. So it is indeed easy to fall into the trap, in a sense, of portraying heterogeneous groups as homogeneously vulnerable, thus neglecting both internal differences between groups, as well as groups that are not considered to be prima facie vulnerable. So vulnerability then ought to be understood also in certain contexts as arising from state actions or inactions. In this scenario, it is in this scenario that what are referred to as tools of state-sponsored vulnerability are deployed and operationalized. So limitations of regular migration channels, laws and policies that prevent irregularization of migration status, states' tolerance of so-called legal black holes, and exploitative situations. This all contributes alongside, again, so-called personal and situational vulnerability to increased risks of smuggling, which in turn may lead to increased risks of trafficking and exploitation. And in the context of COVID-19, not only did we witness an increase in inequalities, in socioeconomic divides, but we were also confronted with further restrictions to freedom of movement and generally mobility. There was a UNODC research on migrant smuggling along several immigration routes that indicated that COVID-19 related travel restrictions have not stopped smuggling or smugglers, and that the economic consequences of the pandemic are likely to lead to an increase in the smuggling of migrants. This is even more relevant in the context of the debate on securitization as a tool to combat smuggling and trafficking, I would add, which is increasingly found to be not only impactless rather than impactful, but even counterproductive. So the fact that migrant smuggling networks tend to have a decentralized structure, they are highly adaptable, thrive in corrupt context, renders them resilient to disruption by law enforcement agencies. And the one thing I wanted to mention, because you talked about recovery and post-pandemic, but in a future post-pandemic recovery phase, which we might not yet be into, an asymmetric recovery from the pandemic may increase even further the risks of smuggling for people in economic need. This could be even more dramatic if dire economic conditions are then combined with continued stringent mobility restrictions and lack of access to regular migration pathways. So if I may, just one more minute maybe. I talked about research from UNODC on the impacts of restricted mobility and COVID, but there's also another set of research on securitization that reveals a complex reality. And this complexity includes, for example, the importance of recognizing and distinguishing between the variety of actors that are engaged in the facilitation of so-called irregular movements. It's not only smuggling networks that are decentralized. It can be lone actors. It can be anything on the spectrum from organized crime to family members that could potentially be involved in, again, irregular movements. It needs to adequately consider and address the unintended protection implications of anti-smuggling measures and demonstrated harmful human rights effects of anti-smuggling policies, and understanding and taking into account the role of facilitated journeys and smuggling within the reality of unavailable, safe, regular, accessible pathways for refugees and migrants. So all these elements, and maybe we can go back later on to the question of agency and vulnerability, but all these elements ought to be taken into account, be that in relation to COVID or on a broader note.
Yeah. Naomi, thank you for shedding light for us in terms of sort of setting up this, just in terms of the legal language that's really involved around this, but and I think also in understanding kind of some of the lines that we see between trafficking and smuggling, and I think that's very important, and some of the issues that you've also brought out. Yes, we would like to hear a bit more about agency, and I think particularly in the context of the GCM, and knowing that one of the the cornerstone, we were just in a session now in the People's Migration Challenge where we're talking about regular pathways, and as long as we continue not to have regular pathways for migrants, we will continue seeing irregular pathways being an option, and so in a way it's as though we were enabling it by not providing the pathways, whether it's countries in the global north or in the global south. I mean, there are even countries in the global south that are you're not able to move from one country to another, even just mobility, let alone migration is something else. So I think we will be coming back to you in terms of talking about, the shift that we need to see, and in terms of the focus, the refocusing that has to happen. And we see in the chat that there's some interesting reflections. Let's just take a move to kind of in a scene, and we move to Niger, and I'll ask Sophie to join us, as she unmutes herself and her video, if it's possible, just for us to hear what these phenomena look like in a national context. And I will just give an introduction of Sophie, because I think it's important for us to know where she's sitting. And so Sophie Hoffman is the program manager in the Immigration and Border Management Unit in IOM in Niger. And she has been working in the field of international development cooperation for quite some time. She has worked with many other organizations before joining IOM, where she's based now in Niger. And she has spent about 8 years working in international cooperation agencies and NGOs, including GIZ, Handicap International, in Central Africa, in the Sahel region, DRC, Chad, and I mention these countries because they're very important and relevant for what we will discuss a little bit later on in terms of regional movements in that area, and she is managing a program there that's kind of looking at immigration and border management since 2005, if I'm not mistaken. I think there's been quite a cooperation around border management projects in that area. So an understanding of what's happening at the institutional level has been very important, but as well as understanding what kind of new approaches could be in addressing irregular migration and many other aspects. Sophie, I won't speak on your behalf because I think it's important for us to hear from you. So maybe as we pose this question to you, we know that, that there's quite some movement that has, surfaced. Maybe it's new to us reading it in the last couple of years over the Central Mediterranean route. And we would like to get an understanding from your side, what is the profile of migrants moving along this route, and maybe also tell us what the route is, because we have students from different parts and we have participants joining from different parts of the world who may not be conversant. We also want to understand a bit what is motivating migrants to move, what motivates people to move, and what's happening around women and children. And then also, what can you tell us about kind of the smuggling networks that you see in your workspace as part of IOM in Niger?
Thank you very much, Patty. And good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear me and see me well.
Yes,
I'm
we can
not
hear
sure if
you.
the camera is working.
The camera is not
Okay.
working, but we hear your voice clearly.
Okay, so let's start like this and hopefully the camera joins us along the way. So thank you very much for the questions. I really think it's important to give a concrete example of a specific migration route, which is indeed the Central Mediterranean route. So first, what is this route? What exactly does it refer to? So it's the route that starts well in Western and Central Africa. So either the central part or the Gulf of Guinea, mostly, that goes through mostly through Niger. This is why it's so important for us. So the main crossing point is Agadez in Niger, and then you have two routes: the one up north through Libya, and the other one through Algeria. So those are the two main components of the Central Mediterranean route. And it's important to note that it's the deadliest migration route in the world. So this is why it's so important. And indeed, Niger is in the middle of that. So it's the main transit country especially for sub-Saharan Africans. And it's important to know that Niger is the last mile of the ECOWAS mobility region. So it's beyond Niger, it's not ECOWAS anymore. So the rules change when it comes to migration and mobility requirements. So since we had a lot of death and pressure from especially European countries, transit countries have had to rule around this topic. So for instance, in Niger, a law has been adopted in 2015 and came into force in 2016, criminalizing smuggling of migrants. So it really criminalizes the traffickers, but not the victims of trafficking. So not being an irregular migrant is not an offense as such. And on the contrary, migrants are quite protected. So this is also what makes border management so important. It's because now we have less, indeed, the route is less active, but a lot of alternative routes are used. So this is even more dangerous for migrants. This is why you need to protect them. So you asked about the profile a bit of migrants, who moves and why. So we have a lot of flow monitoring points. So IOM is really well known for the DTM aspect. So the displacement tracking metrics. I'm just copy pasting the link of our latest DTM in the chat, so you can have a look. So there are a lot of information, but just for you to have a big picture. So more than 80% of the movements taking place stay within the sub-Saharan region. So sometimes Europe or other countries have the impression that it's very massive, but still more than 80% just stay in the continent or towards Algeria, Libya, sometimes Morocco. And less than 20% try to reach Europe. So since we are looking at this route, specific route, taking routes in Central Africa, and especially ECOWAS region, so the majority of migrants are young males between 15 and 30 years old. The majority are from Mali, Guinea, Ivory Coast, or Nigeria. But it's indeed important, and you were mentioning women and children, and that's true that it's an increasing proportion of the migrants. Usually, it was a quarter, more or less, of the migrants on the Central Mediterranean route being women and children, but now the figures have been growing in recent years, reaching more or less 20%. And they are specifically considered as vulnerable migrants and victims of trafficking. So why are they moving? So this is a very good question. I mean, it goes beyond what IOM knows, but from what we've captured, you can at least see that it's very old mobility on the continent. It's historic travel, historic movements, and it's also part of regional integration. For instance, if you're an ECOWAS citizen, you can just stay for a maximum period of 19 days within an ECOWAS country with just your national ID and vaccination booklet. So this is really, promoted. but still now why they go beyond ECOWAS. It's true that it's always characterized by, high level of mobility, whether due to conflict, weather hazards, demographic pressure, poverty in general, lack of access to services, or just lack of opportunities in life, education, work. So in most of our studies, we always find out that 91% of migrants in transit in the region who are surveyed just say that they are moving for economic reasons. So 91% is very big proportion. And lastly, just quickly going through the maybe who are the traffickers and who, organizes the traffic. I will send you the link to, I'm just stating some quotes from a study we published, led by IOM Mali. So on the profile of migrants along the smuggled migrants along the central Mediterranean route. So we'll have all the details, but just very briefly, it's important for you to see that 85 to 90% of the movements, irregular movements, are made with the facilitation of traffickers. So it's the vast majority of the movements. So it's important to make a distinction between the type of person who organize, coordinates, traffics. Sometimes they have overall responsibility for the operations, but sometimes just resource, people, just accommodation, vehicle, etc. So it's important to look at the mapping of actors, specifically on this route. Of course, you have the organizers, but you also have recruiters. You have the people who just do, transportation, and so the study comprises a mapping that you can see. And the last aspect, maybe that I can just briefly mention to you, is the level of organization of traffickers. Sometimes we always see this as a very, very, very highly organized network, while it's a bit more diverse than that. So there are different types of organized criminal groups. So whether in terms of size, level of activity, degree of organization, or even dangerousness, I would say. So schematically, just a brief distinction would be between, on the one hand, traffickers that are part of an organized criminal structure with a high level of organization, professionalism, but also there are migrants that go through a series of informal services in an ad hoc manner. So along the way, which are provided by a chain of individuals. So of course, the law and the different corpus treats the offense differently depending on the typology of the traffickers. But again, I will send you the report, and all the details are available in this study reports. So very much encourage you to have a look at it in detail.
Thank you. Thank you, Sophie, for these insights into understanding the position of Niger, why we see that prominence. I think it's very interesting to also hear a bit about kind of that, that it's a region, that region, the ECOWAS region in any case has been a place where people have been moving for livelihoods, or whether it's in relation to food security movements, or whether it's in relation to environmental degradation, or whether they have been moving for political or kind of security reasons. So it's been a space where there's been quite some movement. And I was just also intrigued because it seems as though there is something that happened around that peak where Europe was kind of looking and thinking, hold on, all these migrants are headed to our shore. And it seems as though there was an injection of resources and support that came from European partners to sort of say, let's keep the migrants, and I'm saying it more in a crude way, as we would in civil society, calling it a spade. Let's keep them where they can be better managed rather than on our shores. And there's, reading through, you also hear how the fall of the Gaddafi regime, and also kind of this anti-smuggling law has caused kind of a shift in the pattern of how that migration was managed. So it's a bit of a challenge to you, Sophie, as I bring you this question. It's something that's just come up, and to think about, what can we then say about smugglers and what has happened in this space in terms of the policy? Do you think it's been sort of an enabler, or has it been something that has actually come to curb migration in this particular space, particularly beyond the migration beyond the ECOWAS region? That's kind of a question. I don't know if you are happy to respond to this now, Sophie.
Oh yes, maybe just a few thoughts, of course, since it's a very broad and of course interesting topic. But no, it's true that with the revolution in Libya, the change in Libya in 2011. And then the fact that Niger ruled against smuggling, it had an impact, quite a big impact. I also have a few reports that I would share with you. But from what we notice, especially me from a border management perspective, is that the former routes, the two big routes that I mentioned, there has been a curve in the number, the figures of migration. Of course, the aim is not to have a decrease of migration in general, but just that it's done in an orderly manner that is secure for everyone, for the migrants and for the state. So there's been a big drop on the route towards Libya. The numbers have really shifted. But this is why it's even more dangerous now, because a lot of alternative routes are in place now, and IOM is doing search and rescue up north in the desert, and it's very often that people are just abandoned by the trafficker or just lost, or sometimes even states they do expulsions back to Niger. Yeah. So then IOM is here on the other side, just trying to first save the migrants and then do reintegration, take them through the voluntary return process. But it's very sensitive because, well, it's a right for you to move. But then when you do it irregularly, then you can expose yourself being a victim, but you're not in accordance with the laws and the entry requirements. So this is also why us, with the border management perspective, we support the state of Niger a lot, so that we manage to make migration as regular as possible and prevent irregular migration. So this is really the objective.
Thanks, Sophie, and we will come back to you, I think, to talk to hear a bit more about what IOM's work is. I just want to take a short break from Africa and cross over to India, actually India via the Gulf, and invite Regimond Kutapan, who is an independent journalist and a migrants' rights researcher. And he is, Regimond is currently based in India, if I'm not mistaken, Regimond, and he has been working around reporting migrant stories in the Arab Gulf. And he's written for several outfits. I mean, he's also written in civil society space for the Migrant Forum in Asia, which is also a partner of this webinar, or rather the course, Routers, The Caravan, Eco Times. He's also published, and he also works as a consultant for ILO and many others. He's done, his recent book is entitled Undocumented Stories of Indian Migrants in the Arab Gulf, where he talks about the lives of Indian migrants in West Asia through the stories from Karela in Oman. And the book is quite intriguing with, a human rights perspective, what exploitation looks like, what marginalization looks like, and a lot of other issues, including irregular migration. Regimond, so this book on undocumented migrants in the Gulf, and particularly undocumented Indian migrants in the Gulf, could you just walk us through your experience in that data collection for that book? The human stories that you encountered, who are the people, what about smuggling in that particular area, and what do you hear from research? And it's nice that you've got these two hats as a researcher and a journalist. What do you hear from research that media and writers don't really bring in terms of migrants' realities and their experience with smugglers?
Paddy, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for the platform. And I'm sorry, I have a very feeble Wi-Fi connection at my home, so I won't be able to go have my video, but I
That's correct.
presume that I'm audible.
You are very audible. We can hear you. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. So I migrated to Oman as a migrant worker, uh, like a journalist. You can say that you can be a blue collar worker or a white collar worker. So I migrated to Oman after doing a short stint of journalism here in India. I got a better opportunity, a better pay. So I migrated to Oman to work as a journalist in a newspaper, small newspaper. And from there, I moved to a big newspaper where I was interested to do migrant stories, because especially the Indian migrant stories, because most of the paid subscribers of that big newspaper were Indians. So the company and the editors wanted me to focus more on Indian stories. I started with small stories, which later on moved to big stories. See, I I always wanted. I was not just a listener. I used to tell their stories, and I used to try my best to help them also by taking them to the embassies, taking them to the court, being their interpreter, writing their applications, grievance redressal measures, and everything. And I was a regular visitor in labor camps, uh, embassy shelters, and it was across all the nationality. When we say when my book talks about Indians, it's the same situation of a blue collar Indian migrant worker and a Pakistani blue collar worker would be facing the same kind of challenges. There is no difference in nationality when it comes to the low strata of the workers. Everybody would be facing the same kind of challenges. So when we do good stories and when our name spreads, people come to us asking for help. Can you tell my story? There are workers stranded in our company. If you tell a story, then that would bring the attention of the government, Arab government, and the Arab government may intervene to find a resolution. We may be repatriated back with our salaries cleared and all. So stories used to come to me. And these workers are the best informers. They know all the in and out of what is happening on the ground. And whatever I learned from migration is not from the it's not from the policymakers, it's not from the meetings, it's all from the workers when they used to tell me the stories, how they came and all. In my book, it's all about undocumented workers. It's not only Indian, undocumented migrant workers and the challenges they face. And there are three stories, chapters, which talk about so-called smuggling or trafficking. I always get confused about smuggling and trafficking. So the book opens with a story of two people who migrated to Gulf country in 1960s on a Persian boat which was going via Dubai. They paid a small amount of money. They risked their life. They landed there in Dubai when there was no UAE, and then they made a living there. They built Dubai, stayed there for 25 years, and they were undocumented for first 3 years. And but they were welcomed. They were welcomed by the Dubai or whichever government it was there. They were not seen as illegal workers. They were able to move around the entire area. Some went to Muscat, some went to Saudi. Nobody asked for any passports at that time. So I don't know whether they were smuggled or trafficked. They stayed, and after only 3 years of after they stay, in the first phase, they made a passport while returning through the help of the embassy. And another chapter which talks about a character these are all real life stories. His name is Majid. He got stranded in Oman. There was no amnesty to go back from Oman. You know, amnesty, which is a scheme announced by the Arab government for the overstaying worker. And he had to go back to Oman. And he was in a situation that he was stranded for 5 continuous years as an undocumented overstaying worker. And there was no way to pay the overstaying fine also. So he took the help of Bangladeshi and Pakistani traffickers, crossed the mountains of Oman, and when there was an amnesty announced in UAE, he presented himself as a Indian stranded who came to UAE and got stranded in UAE. The embassy believed that, and the embassy repatriated back home. So that's one another story. And another story is that there were certain kind of marriage systems in Kerala where the Arab sheikhs would come to Kerala and they say that they are very rich and they would be happy to marry a Keralite woman. These things happened in 1990s or 1980s and all. It was much high in number in 1960s. We call that Arab marriage. In Kerala, Malayalam, we say Arabic Kalyanam. So Kalyanam means marriage, so Arab marriage. So one lady was married off to an Arab sheikh, and she was told that he was a big sheikh there, but he was a security guard in Oman. And she was duped, she was taken there, and when she reached there, she found that she is his fifth wife, and this person had children elder than this newly married Keralite woman. And she stayed there, she gave birth to two children, but he was very much abusive. So she left him, she got a divorce from him. Then she got stranded because she became undocumented as she lost the family status. But then she couldn't go back to India because her children are there, were fathered by the Omani Arab. And she wanted to go back. If she goes back to India as an undocumented, she won't be able to return back to Oman because there is a life ban if you go back undocumented and all. Somehow we did a story, we put up the case in the court, and finally one of the elder boy, came forward and told the court that I'm an Arab, I'm a son of an Arab, so I have the right to sponsor my mother. I will be the sponsor of my mother, and he sponsored his mother, and they all are happy back home. So this Arabic Kalyanam, the Arab marriage system also is a sort of human smuggling or a human trafficking. These are the three stories which I can connect with the human smuggling and trafficking. But rest of the stories are about kafala system, exploitation, overstaying, being undocumented, how they fear from police, how the families back home don't want an undocumented overstaying worker to return also. One person who was undocumented for 20 years, he was overstaying in Oman for 20 years. He was but remitting money by doing menial jobs back to India. But when he returned back through an amnesty, the Indian family didn't want him. He was an unwelcome guest because he didn't make money like others made money. He couldn't make money because he became undocumented. So these are the such kind of stories. And there is a story of a Bihari woman who was trafficked to UAE and then smuggled to Oman and then was made to work as a domestic worker. And she was abused sexually and everything. Somehow she was able to reach out to a person outside. He reached out to me. We went to rescue her with the embassy knowledge and we brought her back to Indian embassy. And then we fought a case with the Arab sponsor and she was repatriated back after paying a fine raised by a community organization in Oman. And I've been into many such rescue operations, which happens always early in the morning because it's a time when Arabs go to the mosque to pray. At that time, the domestic workers are allowed to go out from the house to put the garbage in the garbage bin, which will be on the road. We will be parking our vehicle there. She just comes in and asks, "Is this Reggie?" We say yes. I will ask her name. "Is this Sushmita?" She will say yes. Okay, get in. And then it would be a travel of 2 to 3 hours to the embassy, and we have to take her to the embassy early morning because within 24 hours, if you don't produce a rescued woman in the embassy premises or under the embassy shelter, then what happens is that the Arab government, the Arab employer has a stand to file a case against this lady saying that she left with some theft and she is a criminal and his case will be valid then. So if we rescue somebody, we have to surrender her within 3-4 hours in the Indian embassy. Otherwise, Indian embassy won't be able to get justice for her also. So these are the things what I have to talk about the book and the characters there. All are real life characters. All still some are there in Gulf, some have came back. Everybody are there.
Regiman, thank you for those insights. And I was almost looking at Naomi there and thinking, what actually, when we talk about these lines, they are quite blurry in the experience of where, and I think that's what you talked about, Naomi, that, it's really a continuum. It's not something that you could sort of say, this is where the smuggling starts, this is where the trafficking ends. It's just quite a complex web, as quite a sophisticated facilitation world as migrants try to move in these irregular means. So thank you, Regimon, for shedding light from your experience, from your book, and also from those stories that you have told from the beginning to the end. It's interesting when you talk about kind of the return aspect and what families look at. Where we know what policies have spelled out, and I think the other panelists have tried to bring that to light, but really interesting to see the reactions of families after sort of failed attempts, as families would look at it, or what they would look at as a successful migration journey, and how families back home or unexpected return, which I guess would have happened a lot in the space of COVID. So we'll come back to you, Regimon, to just hear about, as a writer and as a researcher, what you sort of see, looking forward, because the returns are only going to increase, looking at the economic lockdowns and economic slowdowns around the world, and in countries where migrants have been able to sustain their families, but are all of a sudden finding themselves in difficult spaces. Let's move back to the African continent and just have a back again into the world of programs, and also understanding the role that international organizations could play. And here I will ask Miho, if you could just come and explain to us, we know you're coming with a lot of experience. So Miho is a project officer that's leading the Integrated Border Management Unit in IOM in Mauritania. And he previously worked with Frontex. He has Frontex, which is the European Border and Coast Guard Agency. He has also worked around issues that are related to human rights under different projects within the European Commission, working in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, and particularly on projects in Burkina Faso, Guinea, and Mozambique. And he has also worked around issues of human rights at the European Parliament, so coming with that policy hat as well, and understanding what that means from legislators, that type of space, and speaks a lot of different languages as well. So I guess that has been an asset for you, Miho, as you will come to speak to us. We wanted to just get a sense from you, from Mauritania. What do these migration routes look like? What's motivating migrants to move, and we are also particularly concerned to hear a little bit more about women and children. And I understand that there was a case yesterday. So maybe you can walk us through that case as you give us a reflection to some of these answers. Miho?
Yes, I'm with you. Stan, can you see me and hear me?
Yes, see you and hear you loud and clear.
Excellent, because the one of the big challenges before we go into the migration questions, I would say one of the big issues sometimes is the internet here, but today it's working fine, so that's good. Right, so I also would like to, similarly as Sophie, I would like to give a little bit of context, the regional context of this, the migration situation here in Mauritania. And to start with, we need to say that Mauritania is particularly not a source of migration, as not people migrating from, but a transit country mainly. There are several reasons for it. For this, Mauritania is is as big as probably like almost 3 times France, or several European countries, but at the same time it has a population of only 4.5 million. So that's one reason. But another reason is really that historically Mauritanians tend to stay. Of course, there are some who migrate, and there are some who take this dangerous routes of irregular migration, but really it's mostly other nationalities who pass through here. And Mauritania sits in the same region let's say geopolitically as Niger, which is Sahel one, like the smaller, let's say, region, and then it sits within West Africa. So we call it often before I came to Mauritania, we usually heard it as the migration context as the West African route, because many nationalities take this route to get through this the western coast, the western part of Africa to well, some of to Mauritania, some to Morocco, and then further to Spain and around Europe. But recently, especially, and later on, I'll speak also about the increase of this during the COVID times. Recently, more and more migrants take to the the ocean route, the ocean path, taking very dangerous route, because it's not even sea, it's the ocean, so even more dangerous at times. Sorry. And we had several cases of ships and boats drowning, and even we had cases of boats on bodies, really unfortunately, landing on the American coast. So we had cases of people, migrants, setting off from Mauritania and finally not alive, but ending up in the coasts of Brazil, of Trinidad and Tobago. I mean, it sounds incredible, but it happened. We had a very recent case of this, and just in November we had a visit from Interpol regarding that. Our protection colleagues are supporting identifying the bodies. I mean, huge tragedy. So this also shows how little we often know about how many migrants die in the sea. But to come back a little bit more to the roots and causes, I mean, this really links to what Sophie has said. As I said, we are in the same region. The difference of Mauritania is that Mauritania has also 700 kilometers, over 700 kilometers of Atlantic coast. So this added a little bit more of another element of complexity. But really, it's the roots are similar. It's a conflict. So we had a very long period now of instability in Mali since 2011, 2012. It's been really difficult there. We had 2 coups recently, and there have been numerous terrorist or extremist groups operating there. There have been the Murabitun, Al Qaeda, more recently Masina, and several other smaller groups that propagate the instability and motivate people to move. Then there is a lot of recent times. They've been with the climate change. Many people had lack of access to water, and this has been I can tell you that it's been a very interesting time for me since I moved here. I've been quite recently, so I'm still learning a lot about the region. I moved here in the end of September. I took the post in the end of September, but I spent about 3 weeks at the borders with Senegal and Mali and Morocco, where we met, among others, the border communities. And many of them said, the scarcity of water is pushing them to move. There are, the pastoral communities who are getting into conflict with the settled agricultural communities who are the pastoral communities in search of water. So pushing them farther, losing their stock, sometimes because of access to water. And then there is, of course, economic reasons, as Sophie said, a huge part of it. But I need to say, especially in terms of the migrants who take to the coastal parts, to the maritime route, the authorities recently, the last consultation that I had, they reported 80–90% there are Malians who take this route. So really, it shows how instability pushes people. Of course, there are other nationalities that are here, often Senegalese, Gambians, Guinea-Conakry, Guinea-Bissau, but also Niger sometimes, and also Ivory Coast and Nigeria. But Nigeria is, it's over 200 million people population, so it's normal that some of this population will try to migrate. So regarding the profile of people who migrate, it's it depends. We need to see the difference between the ones who take the sea route, or the ocean route. It's mostly male migrants, but we do have almost always cases of younger migrants between 15 and 18 years old, and they are almost always also women. They are in smaller percentage. The last case have been, more like less than 10% probably of the whole, boat that drowned in the capsized actually near to the coast. As you said, it was 2 days ago. It was 2 days ago the case, and there were children also, in small numbers, in singular numbers, but they are there. So that means that this needs to be addressed as well. There needs to be appropriate trainings for addressing the particular vulnerabilities and how the authorities treat these migrants, and how their rights are protected during the disasters like this. So regarding the land route, it's a bit different because there are many more women, and also it's more. There are more different reasons as well found there, because there is an added in Mauritania. There is an added element of. Here is a question whether it's really smuggling or trafficking, because a lot of children being smuggled, but the question is whether it's already trafficking, smuggled to take Quranic studies. They're often accompanied children from Senegal and other countries in the region to take Quranic studies in Mauritania, which is quite also special case. But many people are also smuggled through the land, through the river, actually the Senegal River. And my colleagues from the protection unit, they say that often, for work purposes, it's more like 55% men and 45% women. So it's quite a complex picture, depending what type of migration we look. And one more thing that I want to link to what Noemi said before, about how COVID impacted. Actually, right now I'm implementing a study financed by Japan that's been analyzing how COVID impacted the migration in the region. G5 Sahel, actually, Sophie is also part of this study, and many migrant communities that we consulted said that the COVID pushed them to take irregular routes. And actually, as we talking about this Atlantic route, as the land borders have been closed, so many migrants took the maritime route, the sea route, which is much more dangerous, much more unpredictable and deadly than the other ones, the other routes. So it's apart from the economic impact that has been there as well, poverty increased due to higher prices because less merchandise arrives. Authorities reported that as well. There are delays in merchandise arrivals, and there are increases in prices. So it adds to the element. I can later also, once the study is published later in December or probably already in January, I'll be very happy to share the results so we can all learn from this as well.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing those insights. And I think just situating what migration, irregular migration, transiting through Mauritania I think is interesting to also see what profiles. I think it's interesting, but it's also a sad reality to see the level of desperation, because for me, I would sense that it's a level of desperation, because if you do have a choice to take another route, people would take those choices. And so there's a lot, I think, around motivation that you've talked about that's very important for us. And I think for us here at, in the context of also this discussions around the Global Compact for Migration, it just shows us the interconnection between issues. So we can't sit today and talk about smuggling. And a couple of weeks ago, we were talking about regular pathways. And some weeks ago, we've also talked about what recruitment looks like when people are headed predominantly Middle East, predominantly to other parts of the world. And then there's certain, the issue of regular pathways remains an issue. The issue of not knowing numbers, you talked about saving lives. That's very important because it's almost as though it's when bodies are being discovered that we know that people have been missing. But there's actually not even a space, not within maybe just within the communities, that people would know that they have been missing. And then that interconnection today that has brought us with smuggling and trafficking. I think it's quite, it's quite a confirmation that we cannot deal with migration as in silos, that we have to deal with migration related issues really as from a whole of society approach, but also from a very holistic perspective, because there's so many factors, not to even touch on the vulnerabilities that you have highlighted. So thank you for that. Now we've got sort of a tradition running in that we like to hear from our audience, and I know we've got a couple of questions, and I think this we will, just for the panelists, if I may ask you, we will use this as part of your wrap-up remarks. So I'll give you some time to wrap up in the end. But let's just open up because we've got quite some questions in the chat. There's a lot of different comments. So for those who would just like to just raise your hand, and I will quickly unmute you. We have good enough time for us to have a very good engagement here with our panelists. So I see that there were some questions. Mr. Bese, you are welcome to take the floor. Oh, I try again, one more time. Is that better? Let me do this. Okay, now we can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay,
Mr.
thank
Bassey,
you very much. All right, thank you very much. My name is Mr. Bassey from Nigeria. In the context of definition, country tends to define terms to suit their policies in their favor, and they define it against others for a purpose. My question is that, how can we come to that same terms in place of ethics, whereby every divination suits everybody, every divination equals everybody? So what I define is what you define, what country A define, what it means. If I say I'm smuggling, if I mean smuggling, it means smuggling to all country, not some country smuggling or some country work placement. How do we come to that terms whereby definitions, interpretation to all parties involved means one thing? That's what I want to know.
Mr. Ngozi. Ngozi, over to you.
Yeah. Okay. I saw Mr. Nicholas. The name there is Nicholas. I don't know if it's your name. The man that worked with that's working in Mauritania. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you say that COVID, people complain that COVID, or from your research, I don't know, that COVID pushed people to be using the maritime routes. But in some of my studies, I interviewed some migrants. They are telling me that they are using that route because of activities of frontiers in the central route, in the central Mauritania. Another comment I have to make is, with the new release of action plan for Nigeria last 3 months. There is new. I saw that Frontex has a new role to play in African countries, especially in Nigeria. They have to make the bordering stronger in Nigeria. I mean, they will come into Nigeria and start collaborating with the Nigerian immigration services to make a movement more difficult. Don't you think they are playing into the hands of smugglers and traffickers? Thank you.
Ngozi, thank you for that. Benedict?
Yes, hello everyone. So my question, I wanted to inquire if concerning the Sudan route, the Sudan-Egypt route. Currently, I'm undertaking a small research on the route. And I wanted to inquire how, if possibly, there is an international platform, or even if the GCM platform concerning in relation to migration, if the platform provides an opportunity for monitoring the different routes, such as the Sudan route, if the program itself can incorporate, or if there's an organization that has a database.
Benedict, we cannot, for some reason, we could not hear you. Do you mind to just repeat your question?
Apologies, Madam. Yes. So my question, okay, to be fast, I wanted to inquire if there's an organization database concerning which incorporates the different migration routes, considering the fact that I'm analyzing and studying the Sudan-Egypt route. I wanted to know if there's an organization that monitors and keeps track of the different routes and the causes of migration on the different routes, and how they can mitigate in order to reduce migration or provide solutions. Thank you.
Thanks, Benedict. I can see that there were some more questions that were asked previously also. I see, Wazauna, do you want to come on and share some of your reflections here also with us? I also noticed that we had some questions also earlier that had been sent. Do we want to raise our hands, or shall we just allow the panelists to answer those, and then we will go into the second set of questions for our panelists? Okay, let's open the floor for the panelists in the interest of time. Naomi, do you want to kick off?
Of course. I know there were maybe one or two questions that were addressed specifically to other panelists. There was one element that I wanted to pick up on. And that was the element of externalization, really, of border control and securitization, and whether that allows for or creates the conditions in which smuggling can flourish. And I think I touched already upon this in my first interventions. And I do believe that is yes. So when I talked about the way in which anti-smuggling measures have unintended sometimes implications, these could well be one of those unintended consequences. Now, when we talk about intention, we have to understand where the policies come from and what interests they serve to understand whether they're intended or unintended consequences. But in most cases, anti-smuggling measures, when they're operationalized in good faith, might have precisely this unintended consequence of closing routes, of shifting routes, and sometimes shifting a route that has in time become safer because it's more familiar and there's more knowledge about the route, to something that is less known. And I know that Michal, for example, mentioned the land route and the maritime route. So sometimes closing a land route that could be safer will not mean necessarily stopping smugglers or stopping regular crossings. What it will mean is the shifting of those crossings into more dangerous and harmful contacts. So in order to plan for effective anti-smuggling measures, if the intent is that to make migration safer, more orderly, etc., bearing also and always in mind that any anti-smuggling measure or anti-trafficking measure should not frustrate the right to leave, as enshrined, for example, in its International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. So all these considerations have to be at the front of any anti-smuggling or anti-trafficking action. Otherwise, the end result is something that is more harmful for individual lives, rights to life, freedom from torture, freedom from forced labor, loss of the freedoms and rights contained in international human rights law. So these assessments have to be done in a very careful manner to reduce the risk, again, of a so-called unintended consequence. So the new role of externalization, including the role of Frontex in the African continent, and in particular, I know that Nigeria was mentioned, or we can talk about other contexts in sub-Saharan Africa, where European, in particular, externalization has flourished. We need to be mindful of these considerations that ought to be part of a risk assessment, not only in terms of human rights risk assessment, but also more broadly, unintended consequences of, or collateral damage, if we want to call it that way. But all of these elements ought to be part of such an assessment. The other element that I wanted to touch upon quickly and then leave the floor to the other panelists is the element, again, of this distinction, because definitions were mentioned. So when we talk about definition, even in the context of international agreements, international fora, we start talking about the power imbalance. And that lack of balance in power among states is reflected in the way in which definitions are construed and then operationalized. So if we talk about smuggling and trafficking, and if we think about the way in which smuggling and trafficking are used as categories, and I know there's confusion. So when I said at the beginning, the distinction in law is clear, it makes sense, it's logic. It makes sense according to a certain paradigm, to phrase it better. It doesn't make sense in practice. Also, because we're lacking awareness of what the two are, hence we are conflating them into one thing, which is not. And secondly, because this lack of awareness about what smuggling and trafficking mean in practice lead to actions that are framed under one of the two categories, but actually target the other sphere of exploitation or the other element in general. So the definitional power of, being able to define something already tells us which interests are being catered for, even in the context of the Global Compact, for example. So we do keep this distinction, but we have to bear in mind the power structure in which those definitions are created, which will mean, in turn, and I will close and wrap up, that they will reflect a particular understanding, a particular paradigm, and particular aims and objectives, which may not be universally shared.
That's right, Naomi. I'm just also wondering whether I think, was there an intent, and I'm trying to simplify something that's extremely complex, but in thinking about Mr. Bass's question about, when will we ever define certain concepts, or when will we ever make policy statements that will mean the same? It doesn't matter who is talking about them. So when we talk about saving lives, what do we really mean? And I think that the world woke up with COVID thinking that we had cold water and ice slapped on our faces. So we would wake up to this reality that a life is a life and a life is to be saved. So, do we ever get in that space? I mean, I guess what you're saying, that even in the legal terms, we still have these power imbalances. And we're also seeing it in the context of the Global Compact. I think this is one of the kind of undertones that we have seen in our discussions here on the Global Compact for Migration series, that there is this imbalance, as though some countries wanted that particular objective to be there. Others didn't feel they could take on the responsibility, but were still going to sign it. It's non-binding anyway. And so at the end of the day, we're kind of wondering, was there actual intent? So we're going back to ask, is there an intention to actually strengthening transnational cooperation on countering smuggling? Or is the intent to keep them at bay and to keep us safe? So it's kind of a question that I will come back to you for your reflections, maybe something to tell us about this disconnection that we see in the GCM, which indeed is non-binding, but we also know that a lot of the GCM is pinned or hinged on legislation or on commitments that countries have already signed up to. So what the compact did is to bring everything together in one space and say, it's non-binding, but can we speed up on some of the things we have to do? But then what is really hindering us from making these kind of efforts? So it would be interesting to just hear from a very open space and a very open heart from you when we speak. Benedict, is that an old hand, or do you want to come back again before I move to? Okay, that's good. Shall we have Sophie? Would you like to share responses to some of the questions? Thanks again, Sophie. I see you've been responding also in the chat to some of the issues, but could we hear from you, Sophie? And maybe as you are coming back, Sophie, I think one thing that came as a question, but I think it was probably sent to my side, was to also understand in the context of all these issues that we've talked about, and from that border management perspective, just if you could zoom in for a minute or two on kind of IOM's work there in kind of supporting governments in strengthening this capacity. Because you talked about, you know, in one end, you've got IOM trying to do something for migrants and having kind of this, the challenges and the difficulties which are there. So it would be interesting to hear from Niger's perspective, the work that IOM is doing on counter-smuggling.
Sure. Thank you very much, Paddy, and for all the interest and interactions with the audience. I think while, you know, briefly summarizing what IOM does in Niger in terms of supporting the government, it will reply to most of the questions I saw in the chat, especially regarding, you know, protection of personal data of migrants, etc. So I think it will be a nice wrap up. So very briefly, so as most of us said, states have the right to know who's on the territory and to rule on the entry and exit requirements to be legally in the country. So that means that if you do not meet the criteria, you can be irregular. And all the uncontrolled movements of goods and people can be a threat for the people themselves and for the security of the states. So this is where we support as IBM units, so Immigration Border Management, because also, as Michal said, those type of traffic feed and fuel other types of traffic. So it's, you know, feeding each other. So what we do, of course, IOM is very holistic. And you mentioned that, Paddy, that the response has to be holistic and transversal. So of course, our units do protection, our units do reintegration, do social cohesion and new opportunities, economic opportunities for youth, etc. But for IBM, so we are more or less trying to achieve this continuum between mobility and security, but through regular migration. So we support the government in securing and controlling the borders better. So basically, we have 3 layers that we try to follow, and it's based on the strategy of Niger, and especially the National Police of Niger, and the Direction for Territorial Surveillance, DST. So the first layer is the support to the network of fixed land border posts. So you have official entry points, official border crossing points. There are only 32. So of course we support those. We equip, we build, we put new, you know, modern tools to control documents, identity of the travelers. Just the same that you have at international airports, for instance. You provide your passport, a picture, your fingerprints. So we equip with the MIDAS system, but it's not enough, of course. 32 land border posts while you have more than 5,000 kilometers of border, it's not enough. So we also support the other layers, the layers of the mobile means to patrol, to be more flexible for the states and the DST to cover more ground between the border posts. And then the last layer is community engagement and policing. So here is where the security forces build the trust and the collaboration with the communities to have better governance, better reliability, and to you know, exchange information and protect them better. And we build all our projects based on that. So we combine projects. And the aim, very briefly, is to improve, of course, primary inspection. So when you enter a country, you present your documents, you present who you are. If you cleared, wonderful, welcome, please enter, please exchange, please, develop the country and just move around freely. But also this allows the country to spot those who are not compliant and then are referred to secondary inspections. So then we also build on secondary inspection. Okay, why are you not compliant? Did you create a hint with an international or national warning list? Are you a suspect? Are you just not presenting? Are you presenting a fraudulent document? So this is all the network that then the country will support to have secondary inspection, build investigative networks for referrals to anti-terrorism, to anti-trafficking, but also to social services whenever the migrant needs support or help. So yeah, this is more or less what we do, and the legal layer is very important because this is new. We start from scratch. So now we have digitalized, automatized tool to collect those information that are synchronized. So this is new, and it's very sensitive data, right? It's personal data, biometric data. So this has to be very well framed and brought up to standards, to international standards, for all those data to be secured and properly used. So this paves the way, of course, for better use at national level, but also for more exchanges between two countries, two neighboring countries. So for instance, this MIDAS system, it exists in more than 23 countries in the world, and especially in Western and Central Africa. We have 13 or 14, I think, countries who have this system. So if we have strong legal frameworks, strong operational frameworks, then we can exchange data and we can have joint investigations. We can prosecute criminal networks and transnational criminal networks, transnational traffickers. And this is especially the case between Niger and Nigeria. So we have very good, pilot projects paving the way for more collaboration between Niger and Nigeria on this topic based on concrete evidence-based evidences. So yeah, this is pretty much it. And happy to provide any additional documentation that you might be interested in. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophie, for that. And I'm just also wondering, I think it's been some great information that you have shared with us, some insights also to what information, because as the GCM was being signed at the time, one of the big things was that there was a lack of sharing of information. So it's interesting to hear how technology is being harnessed in this case to collect information. But I'm sure we can have a very long chat with you and a lot of questions around quality of information that goes in and sort of the linkages that we have to kind of migration data as it is. We would just take shall we hear from Amiho, if we can hear from you as well, because I think the similar question has been asked very briefly as well. If you could just tell us from Mauritania's perspective and understanding that countries are different and therefore different strategies are being applied in terms of the support that's really going around migrants, whether we're talking about at the level of the smuggled migrants, what kind of support is going, or the kind of support that is channeled through government in providing in strengthening their capacity to deal with transnational networks in the case of smuggling. And if you can also answer one of those, and then we will move to Regimond, and we will have some reflections that will come from GRFDT President.
Thank you very much, Paddy. Yes, absolutely. I can easily link up to what Sophie said. And just very briefly, I want to say that to comment on what Sophie said, I think it's an extremely important work. And I have to say, I heard about the work Niger has done in terms of the border management and data management there as well, both locally in Mauritania and also internationally. And Sophie, I need to say, I heard your name praised many times by many partners, thousands of kilometers away from Niger, but it seems you're doing a great job there. So I think I really want to link to the work that IOM has done here and focus on the Objective 9, the strengthening the transnational response to smuggling of migrants, and point out to some particular elements of this objective to give you a little bit of background. So Mauritania has, the IOM Mauritania has worked very, very closely with the point D of of the Objective 9, meaning adopting legislative and other measures as may be necessary to establish the smuggling of migrants as a criminal offense. So the effect of our support in the country has been the anti-smuggling and anti-trafficking law that was went into force in 2020, in August 2020. It's a very comprehensive law, and to say, very interesting law. I won't go into details because it's a huge law of several dozen articles, but I want to briefly mention just the chapter 3 of the law, which is cooperation, international cooperation in the penal matters, in terms of the penalizing the smuggling of human beings. So, for example, the Article 41 mentions the Palermo Convention, the 2020 Palermo Convention, as one of the tools that should be used by the national authorities, and then several other tools. So I want to say the tools are there. We really need to make them work, not to be just just an idea that the state leaders signed and said, okay, that's it. We submit to that. We commit to it. But really, the commitment should not be just at the political level there, but has to be at the technical level. So then each of the countries and each of our missions, IOM missions and other partners, and partners are numerous here. I won't go into how many there are, but we need to work on implementation of these measures. IOM also worked on spreading public information of the awareness. We had awareness programs on, the threats that irregular migration brings, how many deaths they have been in the sea, and exploitation, through by the traffickers. It's just uncertain what people, go into through the irregular migration. So there is a lot of suffering through it. We also developed gender responsive, which is a point C of the Compact 9, gender responsive and child sensitive cooperation protocols along migration. So specifically, right now, actually, as we are speaking, we're developing the standard operating procedures for disembarkation when, after the search and rescue missions, which is also an important element because this helps us to protect the migrants. This helps us to implement suitable measures to identify vulnerable categories of migrants. Just to give you some examples: pregnant women, minors, people who are in sort of form of exploitation, disabled people, or people in need of medical help. So these SOPs are an important element we can take into account. But I also want to mention how important it is to look at it comprehensively, to really look at this objective and to include it in the strategic level. So each country really should have a integrated border management strategy that incorporates countering smuggling and many other elements. But this should be there. Data collection. So we mentioned that how important is reliable data. I mean, without reliable data, we cannot really implement reliable policies because we'll not know from which countries the trafficking or the smuggling networks operate. What are the principal nationalities that are smuggled. Also, then we need to implement develop and implement suitable investigation techniques, because through these we can know, who is the trafficker, who is the smuggler here, who is the smuggled migrant. So we do not punish both of them, or we just let the problem on the side. We deport both of them, and we don't care about the problem. Then we just let it perpetuate. And then very importantly, in this legislation, the 2020 legislation really goes into it, the international cooperation of the judiciary. So penalizing the smuggling. So in this way, we comprehensively can address the problem, but without really looking into, into the details implementation of these commitments. So for example, the point A of the objective mentions the protocol against the smuggling of migrants and by land, sea, and air. Supplementing the United Conventions Against Transnational Organized Crime that Mauritania ratified in 2005. Well, let's see how long it has taken, 15 years, to really have this comprehensive law. So one thing is signing a document, and another thing is really implementing the measures and looking at it through a comprehensive integrated border management approach. So I really want to end here because we can speak about it for ages. But thank you very much. Thank you. I'm open to any questions.
Thank you, Miho, for sharing those insights. And I'm sure that the documents that you have that you will share will certainly help, particularly also our students, but also participants who are really interested in understanding kind of the at that national level, what's really happening. I like what you said, lots of policies, lots of signed documents, but the only way to see that we're doing something is implementation. So it's really interesting to hear you say that in terms of kind of wrapping up, in terms of some of the challenges I think that we have is on the implementation side. Regimond, can we hear from you in terms of sort of your reflections? On this subject? I know we are, you are a researcher, but you're a journalist as well. And today we're really looking to for you to pull out that journalist hat and kind of speak to us about what you see as the future. What are we missing in terms of moving and shifting some of these things? And then we will wrap up. I think, Naomi, we didn't have a chance for you to hear your 1 minute wrap up before we move to Professor Binod. Regimond.
Yeah, in the post-COVID period, in terms of labor migration, I fear more smuggling and trafficking. And already I am getting cases of people being trafficked or smuggled or duped and being taken to UAE and other Gulf countries. It's because India suffered a huge economy loss and job loss in the COVID time. And we are still struggling to come back. When there is no jobs here, we will be desperately looking for jobs outside. And when we are looking for desperately jobs outside, it is a playground or a prey ground for the traffickers and agencies. So they come and recruit on false promises, and the people fall prey to their false promises and go. Last week, we had a case of 20 nurses duped, and a few months ago, we had 3 nurses duped. So it's going to be high, the trafficking, because the reports here say that those who lost their jobs in India during the COVID, out of that, 40% have not got back their jobs. Even the economy, when the economy is back and when the lockdowns are being removed and all. So when there is no job, people will desperately look for a job. And when we desperately look for a job, we will be fall prey to the traffickers, and we are getting more and more cases. Sorry, I can't hear you. I couldn't hear you.
That's okay. Thank you. Thank you for sharing those reflections. Thank you. Noemi?
Yeah, so just to wrap up, really, and I will be quite brief. You mentioned earlier the non-binding nature of the global compact, but the fact that corresponding obligations or duties or paradigms are present in other binding instruments. What I wanted to focus on in this context is that yes, the global compact itself commits the promotion of, ratification of, accession to, and implementation of, for example, the smuggling protocol, insofar as Objective 9 is concerned. But Objective 9 is still linked at its core to protection of borders, to concerns around border management and mobility, rather than being focused on acknowledging and addressing the underlying reasons why smuggling exists in the first place. But migration goes beyond borders. It's not only about the management of borders. It's about understanding why borders are being, if we want to use the compact language, breached in a certain sense. And it is only through that paradigm shift, so from borders to a broader understanding of migration, that a concrete effect can be achieved. So it is time, in a sense, at least in my opinion, to rethink the legal and policy structures that shape the way in which we conceive migration and border management, moving beyond the criminal or securitized paradigm and towards what you have termed, and I think quite on point, an holistic understanding of mobility and rights. Otherwise, we will continue to remain in these sort of dichotomy between imposing definitions and shaping migration as only being concerned with breaches of immigration laws and criminal laws, without addressing the underlying understanding of what borders are in the first place, which would potentially be useful in reshaping the discourse.
Naomi, thank you for that. Thank you for sharing that. And now I would just ask for GRFDT President to Professor Binod Kadria to share with us his reflection.
Thank you, Paddy, for this opportunity. The session has inspired me to share some of my thoughts. This has been an extremely rich session with all four presenters making very important inputs in terms of this highly volatile, case of smuggling and trafficking of migrants. I think we have had, 4 different complementary presentations about this issue. But what comes to mind is what Noemi has emphasized at the end, is that it is not only about border management. It is about understanding trafficking and smuggling. First of all, the difference itself that she emphasized, and Regiman has also mentioned that this was something, an eye-opener in terms of understanding the differences, the minute, subtle difference between the two categories is extremely important. And in her presentation, at some point, she had mentioned the trafficking and smuggling by family members. That I think is extremely important in the sense because that would not come under the radar of, irregular activities by smugglers, by professional traffickers, and so on, by family members. When it is done, it is happening through regular pathways. And one example I would like to share, which I had deposed before the upper house of the Indian Parliament a few years ago, is the instance of fraudulent marriages that takes place in India by migrant grooms who come to India, particularly to the state of Punjab, which is highly, prone to getting into this kind of a trap of giving away their young brides to already married people who just hide their information in the greed to get the large dowries that go with the Indian culture. That I think is extremely important. And I had deposed before the Indian upper house of the Parliament committee to say that this kind of fraudulent marriages should be declared as trafficking. So it's a question of definition. Unless and until we actually bring them in the net, this will just slip away. We'll, 20%, 30%, 40%, or whatever is the proportion. I'm giving just one example, but Rajiman had also mentioned about, other examples that are there, false promises and so on. Who makes those false promises? Is it only the agents, the recruiters, or it is also by the family members and friends? So I think we have to get out of the stereotype. As I said the other day, we have to look out of the box and find ways that are not only, characterized by the documents, by the clauses, and by the conventions, and so on. Those are important, but at the same time, we have to supplement them with the new definitions, new understanding of the whole issue. That I think it has been a great session, and we need to build upon this. And I think we should think of making recommendations to the GCM committees later on, at the right moment, later next year when it meets for a review of the progress that has been made. Thank you again.
Professor Vinod, always great to have you join us and share your wisdom. And thank you again for just basically, yes, summarizing it better than even I would try to, and so I will not attempt to, except to say thank you very much to our panelists, to Sophie, to Regimont, to Noemi, and also to Miho for being here with us today, and to have had the opportunity to dive into this subject from many different angles and perspectives, many geographical locations, which is very important. And that also, reminds me when we talk about definitions, I always think about my mother tongue. And often after a webinar, I think actually, if I had to describe this in the language that I was born speaking, I actually wonder what we're talking about, because English is not my mother. I mean, I speak it as a working language, but I was not born speaking it. And I think a lot of us probably identify with that. So language becomes very important. And I think we are particularly at a time post-COVID where we're conscious of language, we're conscious of concepts, because we have formulated policies around this language. And the language of counter-smuggling today is what we try to go into, to understand what these concepts look like from a legal perspective, from migrants, from the perspective of those who support migrants, from various angles, and particularly also from our participants who join us every single Tuesday, every single Saturday when we meet also in the classroom to unpack some of these issues that look to have very important global relevance because they're set up there. But in actual fact, migration is happening very much in our spaces and in our backyards. So with all that has been shared today, I think we've had a very enlightening session. Thank you very much to all the panelists. Thank you very much to all the participants. We will see you on Saturday for the students. The same time, we continue with our lecture series. And next Tuesday, we are talking about eradicating trafficking. So if you were confused today about smuggling, you can show up again next week so that you can get clarified on what trafficking is and what joint efforts are happening, not just at the global level, but we also even have human rights activists who will be joining us talking about eradicating trafficking from that perspective. So thank you so much for joining us today. Have a good afternoon, I think it's good morning still in some parts, good afternoon, good evening, and good night to our friends in Asia Pacific. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thanks. Thank you.